You're listening to the Back Home Network, presented by Home Field Apparel.
Saw the
Games,
physical
and
basketball
I was at the games.
versus
You were
physical
not.
fouling.
You watched them on YouTube.
Anyway.
I saw the games. I watched the games at the time.
Well, we're here. I'm Bob Boats. Welcome to X's and Joe's, a podcast dedicated to decoding the winning formula in college basketball.
And I'm Mike Weemuth. Welcome you to Episode 5, Rivalries. What are they? How do they impact us? And why do we love to hate them? Recorded on the evening of February 14th, 2024. So, Bob, 2 weekends ago, we were together in Bloomington at last.
We were back at it, basically acting like we were undergraduates again, although we were asleep a lot sooner than usual. The 4 a.m. conversations we do this now, so it's kind of the same thing, right?
Yeah, basically, yeah.
Yeah. So, hoofed it back from Assembly Hall to the Assembly Call guys over at Upstairs Pub. Took us about a half hour.
That was lovely. Yeah, good exercise, and we didn't need a crash cart by the time we got to Upstairs Pub.
Spent 25 minutes talking about how IU could have or couldn't have stopped Ace Baldwin.
Yeah, exactly. It was a good scouting report, all the way from McNutt, past the Union building. So, yeah. It was lovely.
By the time we hit Kirkwood, we're like, okay, there's the upstairs, and where'd La Bamba go?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, the laundry list of places that we used to hang out at that are no longer there is rather depressing, but there are still a lot of fun things, and some of our favorite places are still standing, luckily.
And some new places too. Fat Dan's was lovely, as you know.
Awesome.
That was your first time there. I know that was the first restaurant I took my kid to. So we're big fans. But I will say, you just go to these places, and what was great about the meetup was we got to meet all these really cool people that listen to the shows and are part of this overall community through the Back Home Network, and just really got a chance to kind of get to know them a little better, and just get kind of listen to what they were thinking and kind of how they see things are going, and get to hear their stories, and also just again make new friends, which is kind of the whole point of going to Bloomington, right?
Exactly. Yeah, it was great meeting the fans and also the Back Home Network team. Jared, Andy, Coach, Ryan, Scott, Galen, Kathy, Jeff. Finally got to meet Tony face to face after all the text messages we've exchanged over the last year or two. So that was nice. And meeting the spouses was also great. So
that was.
Yeah, I don't know about you. I sometimes get worried that you have that one thing in common with people online, and then you meet them in real life and you have nothing to talk about because you have zero in common outside of that one thing. But luckily that wasn't true with the Back Home Network folks. Everyone had a good sense of humor. They were fun to chat with about all things, that did not include basketball. So that was great.
Yeah, genuinely great people. And again, I was surprised. Again, I think we both remarked, these people are tall, compared to
the camera angles are definitely interesting on Assembly Call and Crimson Cast. I will say that.
All I know at the end of the day is if this were Hoosiers and that was the team, I'm Ollie.
Yeah, exactly. I went in thinking I was a wing forward or a 3, but I was definitely more of a 2 in that group. So.
Didn't we make you play 5 in our hyper basketball?
I think we had to. Yeah, I think that was I was forced into. It was AJ Moye playing the 4 kind of thing. Yeah. I will say among all the things the great highlights of the weekend, Galen Clavio holding court is much watched viewing. It's I would pay hard cash to watch Galen stemline on a variety of topics.
Agreed.
He was like the Demosthenes of the Kirkwood bar scene that night. No. So
I would say that you finally put to rest something for Galen, which is the whereabouts of one Lionel P. Twinkles, which I know he was very which came up and we're like,
Exactly.
There's a legacy 25 years later. It's a beautiful thing.
Exactly. You run a joke ticket for trying to destroy student government, and a quarter century later, people are still talking about it. So that's lovely.
Touche.
Yeah.
True point. Yeah. So speaking again, we talk about the bison, and we talk about the bison.
Mm-hmm.
We have to talk about something home field, our sponsor of the Back Home Network. All of our great shows here did right before the IU Purdue game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was perfect timing. They had a drop of both Purdue and IU materials. 80s and 90s apparel galore, basically. It was definitely Gene, Katie, Bob Knight era stuff. I actually saw, I don't know if you saw on X, Calbert Cheney posed with the new 1993 Big Ten IU championship shirt that Home Field released, and that was definitely a nice connection to the rollout for the stuff.
So it was great. I saw it as I was scrolling through, going, and I was like, "Oh, I got to get that
Mm-hmm.
because that was my senior year of high school, and so
right.
That was what kind of drove me, one of those." Just that. And then my wife is sitting here 10 minutes later, she's scrolling through going, I think you want that, don't you? I go, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We're thinking, birthday's coming up, Easter's coming up, Arbor Day's coming up. Doesn't matter what the holiday. Let's look at that.
Yeah.
And, again, it's just really a cool piece there, as well as other wonderful memory type pieces from the one with the 76 team, one with Assembly Hall. And also a quarter zip with a bison on it too, which looks really cool. I was
impressed with the hyper. They had the hyper shirt that shows the level of specificity that Home Field has in terms of the merchandise that they're putting out. So that was definitely cool.
That is.
I especially appreciate that they have IU gear in black for those of us grads who don't exactly look too cool in the crimson stuff. And yeah, I think we both remember. If there's a picture of me wearing red somewhere out there, I think that would be like a scavenger hunt item for people.
Since 1995, I don't think I've ever seen you wear red.
Exactly.
I mean, that's been we're going on 30 years, brother. I would 30 years.
I would probably have to lose a bet, I think, for someone to see me in red.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So Home Field. Great stuff, and I definitely recommend it. I've already recommended it to not just IU fans, but I did tell some of my Purdue pals about the latest drop. So it's the perfect gift for any serious college basketball fan any time of the year. Be sure to check out all the great retro wear they have to offer at homefieldapparel.com.
So Mike,
Rivalries.
Episode 5, one of our favorite topics here, and I know one that we talk about a lot, and one that I know is a special passion for you, and what we're going to kick off with is the idea of fan psychology and this sort of almost 1, 2, 3, 4, what are we fighting for approach in the minds of us as we're looking at this and seething or celebrating, depending on the situation.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, I think this is going to be a fun topic and segment because, like I said, it does allow me to jump into my favorite sports side hustles, which is the psychology of fans. I probably could do a 3-hour lecture on this, but we're going to be generous and really boil it down to a Cliff Notes version just for this conversation. So, simply put, rivalries. Why do they exist? So rivalries exist because of human psychology. We can tell it's psychological because we react to rivalries on emotional terms, not rational ones. I think everyone kind of understands that. Think of all the ways we allow our emotions to get tangled up with our rival schools. Like, think of, why do fans nervously check their phone to see the score of their rivals' games, even when their own teams have the night off? Or why did that crazy Alabama fan poison the trees at Toomer's Corner in Auburn after that, loss to the Tigers in the Iron Bowl? Or why do basketball fans have that sense of relief when their rival school finally exits the NCAA tournament? Like, now I can finally enjoy the dance now that so-and-so school has finally, is no longer tormenting my bracket. So the idea of all this is that rivalries can be explained in two basic concepts of social psychology. It's group identity and social comparison. These are concepts most people may remember from, let's say, your Psych 101 class in high school or college. And they do play a huge role in how fans behave within these rivalries. And during this, after the show, we'll drop some of the psych research materials in the show notes if people really want to dig through the topic themselves. But for now, we'll just explain briefly how rivalries work inside the brains of fans. So at the beginning of people's sports affiliation, sports fandom typically starts in childhood, usually with your parents' favorite team. And you're slowly indoctrinated into that fan base, roughly the same way someone might join a religious order. So as you grow into that group, you learn all the rituals of the team, the chants, the fight song, the history, traditions. You'll start wearing the team colors like there's some kind of required uniform. These activities begin to cement your sense of identity with the team, not just in how you view yourself, but how others start to view you. Just think of that, Bob, do you remember roughly how old you were when you started really identifying as a IU fan or a Reds fan?
Reds fan, I was really, really little. I remember the late 70s teams. I remember being in tears at 4 when they lost to the Pittsburgh Pirates.
Oh, wow.
In the NLCS. Around the same time, that was the same year when my parents were Indiana State grads. So, But I took about 5 or 6. I realized that Indiana and Indiana State were two different places. Okay. So at that point, I began to start gravitating more to the cream and crimson. We drive by and it's like, whoa, this is something. You go to Dunn Meadow, you go to the Union, and you're like, man, I feel like I'm in something big. Yeah. And I remember that time. And yeah, so about 5 or 6 for me was really when everything kind of solidified.
Okay. No, that makes sense. And that kind of tracks. I mean, generally, the research says that by the time you're 8, your fandom becomes generally self-sustaining, meaning that you don't need outsiders pushing you into the fan group. You'll be plenty motivated basically to carry on yourself as a fan at around that age window. So you hear a lot, especially from people I know who are not sports fans. They'll commonly ask me, why is that the case? Why do people get so motivated to join teams when those teams' failures lead to so many ruined weekends and frankly, day drinking? And the main reason is psychologically, people are highly motivated to choose groups that give them a sense of belonging. And a sense of belonging is a critical need of emotional well-being for all humans. So belonging to a team lowers your sense of alienation and isolation, and has a host of other positive benefits to your mental health up to a point. And we can probably talk about that later. So over time, as you experience wins and losses together within the fan group, your sense of emotional investment in that team rises. And I guess, as they say in business school, your sunk cost begins to deepen. And your identity begins to permanently fuse with the team. So the team's success and failure becomes, by extension, your own success and failure. Your neighbors may start to even identify you first as, let's say, a Michigan fan or an Ohio State fan, even above your occupation, religion, and other critical life categories. And you'll even begin to use the language as that seems to assume that your own participation on the team is a real thing. You'll hear people say, not that Michigan won, but we won. And so that emotional investment, as it deepens with the team, you'll start to form what the academics would call in-groups, as well as out-groups, which is essentially your rivals. At the same time, the people in those out-groups, in those rival schools, they'll be going through the exact same kind of fan socialization that you're going through with your own team. And so as over time, the more the more your identity is linked to sports teams, the more strongly you're willing to defend your squad and even antagonize fans from the rival teams. There's even something called disinhibition, which happens when your loyalty to the group is so strong that you are willing to basically engage in antisocial behavior and up to including violent acts.
So I've been around third and fourth graders enough over the years to know that sometimes that sports rivalry conversations when you're 9, 10, 8, 9, 10, and 11 can get pretty heated.
Oh yeah.
And at that point, it's like before you know it, you're basically comparing each other's mother's lack of attributes.
Yeah, the quality of the rhetoric does not improve over time. So.
Well, we've been around enough to know that's true.
Yeah,
Yeah.
No, I when I think of the examples, I always think of like English soccer fans or perhaps the fans of the NFL franchise that just happens to be in my current city of residence. So
they have a reputation.
Just a little bit, yeah.
Santa Claus and batteries just seem to go hand in hand, and not for putting them into toys.
Yeah, and a lockup literally within the stadium for the police, just to make it easier on the police. So.
And an arraignment court. They put an arraignment court down there. I mean, it's
exactly.
It's a thing. It's a
thing. I know people have been to Eagles Court. Yep, that's true. Oh man, yeah. So I guess and you and I are both political people, and we typically hear this term or this concept explained as tribalism by the social scientists. And typically it is a political term, especially for identity politics, but its application to sports is, really just as strong. And so when you're fully invested as a fan, you'll enter basically the second stage of this process, which is social comparison. And what happens during social comparison simply is that, we human beings love to compare ourselves to others. In some ways, we're kind of addicted to comparison. There's a lot of research on this concept called social comparison theory, which basically means people value their own personal and self-worth by assessing how they compare to others. So it's not so much what you have, but how much more or less you have relative to the people around you. So you can see how this, develops within teams. Like if your identity is linked to your team's success, your sense of self-worth can rise and fall depending upon your team's win-loss record. But your relative sense of value is also dependent on what your rival school is doing at the same time. And again, this is not, explicitly a sports-specific phenomenon. Like you think about how people feel when a friend gets a big promotion, a huge salary bump, and suddenly they're moving into a larger house in a nicer neighborhood, or a classmate gets a part, a big play that maybe you wanted to, or you tried out for, and there's research on this, rates of depression spike for people who are the last in their social group to get engaged or married. And so most commonly people will think of these in other terms like, keeping up with the Joneses or FOMO, fear of missing out. It's all basically kind of wraps under the same umbrella of social comparison.
Well, and oftentimes, part of this also is this also fear that, I'm a nostalgic fan. I think you are too.
Oh yeah.
We grew up in a time where I call it the breaking away years at IU, where you had IU basketball winning a national title roughly every 5-6 years. Martha, and the broadcast, every game was on TV and the world stopped.
Yeah.
When that TV show, when Martha the Mop Lady hit the screen, we still do it before every game. I put my son in front of the TV. Here's Martha the Mop Lady. The world will stop for 2 hours as IU plays basketball.
That was a good addition. Yeah.
Maybe 3 hours. Maybe 3 hours before the game so we can go to bed. But it's one of those things where I'm going through the rituals with my kid.
Yeah.
Because there are no existing episodes of Cowboy Bob, left. And if you grew up in this area, you know who Cowboy Bob was. your mom took you to see Cowboy Bob, and now you understand why mom took you to see Cowboy Bob.
Yeah.
But as we're kind of talking about this, there's also that Grey Gardens concept where we're afraid that where we don't want to be. And if you've ever seen the movie, or Mike, you talk about the Magnificent Ambersons is another one where it's like a very well-to-do family, priorly well-to-do. They have this house that has raccoons living in it. They're in this mansion. They're eating chicken out of a pot next to the bed, and these two women, mother and daughter, who are actually an aunt and cousin of Jackie Kennedy.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's Jackie Kennedy Onassis.
Yeah.
And Lee. These two are, just, and you go through about an hour and a half of them just living this weird sort of life where we're socialites.
Yeah.
but our hair, but we're living in like destitute poverty.
It's like, or gilded squalor, another way.
Gilded squalor is a great way to look at it. So we don't want to be a Grey Garden, because then we look at our lives and like, are we still living in this mansion with the raccoons living in it?
Yeah.
I mean, are there feral cats eating eating our garbage?
Yeah.
It's really one of those things I think that pulls at our heartstrings a little bit when we see something that we love so much.
Yeah. Well, you're right.
Brings us great happiness when they're successful.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the whole thing with rivalries, and just your own team performance, especially, it's like they are prestige fights, if you think about it. If your team's or your rival's team wins games or championships, it changes sort of like the relative position of the team and by extension of the fans relative to the other teams and other fans. So, as humans, we're always sort of seeking some sense of social prestige, dominance. Is another way to look at it. But sports is obviously a far less fraught way of going about establishing dominance hierarchies than other ways. But certainly there are some side effects of that when, especially in the parking lot after the game, when the Eagles and the Giants have to leave the stadium at the same time.
Or when we're sitting in row 17 of Ross-Ade Stadium surrounded by Purdue fans, and one of our
dear friends
decides now is the time for us to have a heated conversation and utilize his rapier-like wit and lack of and lack of concern over the physical safety of his friends.
Exactly.
Because we're like, look, if I had 5 people to get into a bar fight, these are not the 5 I'd pick. And Mike, I love you, but you and I are in the same boat with this. We know 4 other people we'd rather have in that situation.
Do you remember like 5 minutes ago, we're talking about disinhibition? That was an example of that.
That was an example. I've seen plenty of those.
Yeah, exactly.
So we talk about the bucket, and we talk about Indiana, Purdue. And so when we talk about real quick, kind of quickly talking about types of rivalries between programs and between, and even individuals. I kind of looked at, when we were looking at this thing, like, break these down a little bit. And so we have what we call what we are going to call traditional rivalries. They're historic and they're geographic. A good example would be Army-Navy, which is a historical rivalry dating back to the beginning of the country and the beginning of the military service academies. Yeah. The rivalry goes, now we go to war, they're on the same team, but they still have this sort of back and forth with each other to say, it's a way, almost like with that rivalry within the service academy rivalries, it's steel sharpening steel.
Yeah.
I think when you look at Ohio State, Michigan, or that's another one that's a traditional rivalry. It's kind of unique because they're from 2 different states, but when you think that those states almost fought a war over the city of Toledo, and by war they put their militias out on the, basically they rose a militia and the other one, and then they had a whole thing, and then basically Ohio gets Toledo, and I think Michigan got something else out of the deal. Yeah. But back in the territorial days, Ohio and Michigan have had this rivalry, so their 2 flagship institutions go at it, which then makes Michigan State upset because they're like, well, we're also a flagship institution.
Yeah.
And so then Michigan State and Michigan have a rivalry as well. So these geographic rivalries, IU definitely fits that bill.
Yeah.
Where these are the 2 largest institutions in the state. They are 2 with deep, rich histories. When it came down to we have a football team, well, we have to play Purdue. They're a couple hours, they're a half day's train ride from Bloomington or West Lafayette, and we'll we're going to do this, and we're going to kind of define ourselves by the fact that we're going against each other. And when you grow up, it's always been IU and Purdue as a rivalry. Same thing with University of Kentucky for Indiana. Same thing for Notre Dame with Purdue. Because of the proximity and because of the prestige of those institutions, now it kind of, one's public, one's private. The other one are two different states, but that also kind of just pushes us into a traditional sort of relationship, and it's never going to go away. You have, I think there are times where, and in programs, we'll talk about times when they have personal rivalries. And I think the one that always comes to mind, for IU fans was back in the late 80s when Lou Henson and Bob Knight were getting into it in press conferences. And really it was more Lou Henson calling him a classic bully. Yeah. At that point, he may be one, but he's ours. And and watching Nick Anderson, you still hear the Illinois fan talk about Nick Anderson. I mean, every time Stephen Bardo sits at half court and he looks at that spot, it's like the greatest accomplishment of his life, even though he didn't do it. Yeah. Nick Anderson hitting that shot. Yeah,
and the Bardo family, I do believe, came out on the floor and celebrated, not just Stephen.
and so
there's history there, obviously, because of the brother playing at IU too. So
right, true, all that, yeah, and so. That personal thing, and now granted, the rivalry from I think from IU's perspective is nothing. And I think, Mike, you've got an idea that, we probably need a matchmaking service for Illinois.
Yeah, no, yeah, I've I had this sort of not so quiet whisper campaign to try to play matchmaker between Illinois and Maryland, since they are I guess they're the two teams in the conference that don't really have strong rivals, obviously. And for years, they've been buggering different fan bases within the conference, trying to, earnestly start up some kind of new rivalry. So yeah, since we don't want to, we don't want any spinsters, flying around alone amongst our conference family, I thought maybe why don't we just engage in a bit of matchmaking and see if we can forge some kind of arranged sports marriage of sorts between Maryland and Illinois.
They're the last two in the friends group. At this point, they're like, we're in our mid-30s. We've got nothing else going on. We kind of like to be around each other. All right, we should just do this because the rest of them are doing it, and we'll just vacation together, basically. Yeah, I think that works.
And it also saves some some of the anxiety of the other fan bases in the conference getting constantly badgered.
Just leave us alone. Go off and do your thing. And so it would be fun. We could be like the Tsarist Yentas of the basketball prairies if we could actually get them, hooked up together. Exactly. And we'll buy them a nice mixer. They'll love it.
Yeah, exactly.
So you got this overt conflict between coaches, and I mean another one. I mean, you and I both, we were in college when this happened. When Calipari's doing in a press conference, and there's John Chaney from Temple right down the road from you.
Yeah, and basically my other school.
Your other school, yeah. He threatened to kill him. He actually threatened to kill the man. Mm-hmm. And so that thing fires up quick. Or players, sometimes you see rivalries between individual players where, like the Bird Magic is probably the best example of that.
Sure.
Where, it starts in college and it carries on to the pros, and they just kind of fell into two franchises that traditionally couldn't stand each other. Yeah. And kind of put an extra edge on a traditional rivalry.
Yeah. Perfect opposites and opposites part of the country too. Yeah.
And it wasn't like, Kobe and Paul Pierce did it. You didn't have that 30 years later with those two, but you definitely had it with Bird and Magic. So it fires up your fan base, but extinguishes with turnover as people leave. It's like, there was a thing once, but we're kind of over it. The other thing with some personal rivalries is that you get a situation like IU and Duke had for a while, where you had Bob Knight and Mike Krzyzewski, where it's the master and the apprentice. Mm-hmm. That sort of power dynamic. I think Dean Smith had that at times with some of his, with especially with Roy Williams at times, where. Yeah. And it just kind of got programs more fired up. It was a great narrative for the media to kind of highlight this sort of relationship between them. And so that kind of fits into more, it's not always a visceral rivalry. Sometimes it's actually a rivalry where you're kind of steel sharpens steel, or it's a great story to go into.
And it's great for ratings, obviously.
Incredibly good for ratings. And
you look at during the regular season, especially like in college football and college basketball, consistently the most watched, most viewed games will typically be like Ohio State, Michigan, or Duke, Carolina, IU, Purdue. It's very rare that it's not a rivalry game. It's the top viewed game during the regular season.
And so, yeah, exactly. If you're going to tune into one game, this is the one you're going to watch. Or if you're going to go to a game, this is the one you're going to go to. Because sometimes you actually go with your neighbors, that sort of thing. I mean, sometimes you will see people who will truck up together, Purdue and IU fans, and just yell at each other, and then they'll barbecue, and then they go home. Yeah. So the other, but there's also, I think, more situational rivalries that we see. I think of UCLA back in the 60s with Houston and Notre Dame, and that it was almost like those circumstances were a little different than what we see, like, let's say, with Duke and Michigan in the 90s, where they're both playing a version of King of the Mountain. And so they create a series. IU Kansas does this frequently. We've rekindled that situational rivalry. That goes back to 1940 with Fog Allen and Branch McCracken, where every few years, the programs feel like we can start playing each other again. We feel comfortable playing each other again. We feel like we can be competitive with each other. So let's give the fans a great game, because we're both traditional blue blood programs, but it can lie dormant for 10, 15 years. Yeah. Sometimes it is that style and image of two programs where you look at you go back to that Duke versus Michigan in the 90s, where it was the Fab Five versus guys like Christian Laettner.
The Laettner and Hurley teams,
Or the other one, which actually weirdly bled over into Indiana in 2002, when Duke and Kentucky, after the Mashburn, Laettner. Again, a personal rivalry, but it becomes almost situational because there's a style and an image of these two programs who are going at each other. And it was so weird that 10 years after the stomp, Kentucky fans are in IU gear cheering for IU, or in Kentucky gear in Rupp Arena cheering for IU to beat Duke.
Yeah, never thought I'd see that.
And so as time goes on and you start seeing, these frequent matchups or conference realignments, you start seeing these situational rivalries pop up with the hope that maybe they elevate to a traditional. Like I was watching Florida Atlantic play UAB at UAB, and I guess it's been fairly hot and contested. Florida Atlantic ended up losing the game, I think, in either overtime or double overtime. And the announcer for ESPN is hyping this, going, they're hoping this becomes a rivalry game between these two teams. I'm like, okay.
Okay.
But it's also because where the two programs sit in the American Conference, they play each other frequently. And with all the realignments, it's like it's time. And also Florida Atlantic has surged under Dusty May.
Dusty May, yeah.
The media is going to be really excited, and they're going to want to, have something more to promote and to try to push more the casual fan, if they're flipping through channels going, I don't want to watch championship log splitting. This looks interesting. It's a rivalry game. It's University of Alabama Birmingham versus Florida Atlantic. Yeah. Obviously one of the high ticket, a top ticket item. Yeah. So
exactly. Yeah. No, that's, I mean, it's interesting. So, you think about, there's like in looking at the psychological angle and just looking at the typology of it, is that there's so many angles at which you could find yourself in opposition to like another fan group. I mean, I kind of like how you showed, geographical is like the most obvious. I mean, you're just kind of living under the same roof and you're just going to be like, kind of at each other's throats, like, young siblings. But you're right. I mean, there are so many different types that can like pop up that don't seem traditional and kind of come and go. So I think the ones we're most used to understanding are like Alabama, Auburn, Indiana, Purdue,
Duke, UNC.
But yeah, you're right. There are those ones that are like kind of geographically untangled. So it's like Notre Dame, USC. Is like one I always love to watch. So
historic, and they've been doing this since the 30s. And I don't know. And I mean, if somebody knows the story without, if you know it, let us know, because it's. I mean, I'm sure I could Google it, but interested to hear from some of you all about that. Like, how did that one happen? Other than other than just the fact that they both figured they could take a trip someplace.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's interesting. Like and how rivalries play, just thinking about like the geographical angle, like living in Indiana and growing up here, I kind of thought I had some sense of like how rivalries operated. And being an Indiana fan, obviously, I kind of looked at through my own lens of what I thought, a rivalry was, how it operated, let's say year to year. I guess I didn't really understand like how intense, like the feeling of that sports anxiety I discussed was until I moved here to Philly, like in the early 2000s. And the time before the Philadelphia Eagles won the Super Bowl. And that time, it was almost like the perfect, like lab experiment for like what we're talking about here, this concept of social comparison and status envy. I'd go to Chickies and Pete's, like the popular sports bar in Philly, to watch an Eagles game. And the broadcast would often invariably flash up that graphic about the NFC East and their dominance in the playoffs. And they would show like New York, Washington, and Dallas, and all their Super Bowls are listed. And then sitting sad and alone down below all of them at the bottom of the list with a 0 next to them is Philadelphia. And I would peek around the bar and you would see Eagles fans like physically wincing at the mere sight of that graphic. It was like they were all getting punched in the groin collectively through the television screen by that graphic. Mm-hmm. And so it's interesting if you're from like one area and you move to another and you start to see a rivalry through a completely different lens, maybe than the ones you're used to, and understand like, oh, okay, that's how they react to it when they're sort of like at this position of the rivalry versus this. Just hearing Cowboys and Giants fans, like how they talk to Eagles fans. It's hilarious. It's like something you would hear like in any college basketball rivalry. This is their Super Bowl. We live rent free in their heads. They're the little brother. We're the big brother. I mean, it's all the stuff you would hear in college football and college basketball, and it plays the same way. But I guess I had never seen it from the standpoint of sort of like the little guy, I guess, in the relationship. And yeah, it's not even just like how they're angry at the other team. They're oftentimes angry at third parties, like the media. Like if you want to experience a true barroom beatdown, just go into any Philly sports bar and repeat the phrase, Dallas Cowboys, America's team. And I guarantee you in about 3 minutes, you're going to be in the emergency room somewhere in greater downtown Philadelphia.
It's not like you don't have the Liberty Bell like 10 minutes away.
Yeah.
like the country's literally founded in this and Dallas.
Yeah, exactly.
I can see that.
Yeah. No, but it's interesting. It's like, when you think about it, like how we debate our rivals, we're essentially playing almost like defense attorney for our squads. We're highlighting all the best arguments for our team. We're ignoring, the most inconvenient information against our own argument for our team. So it's why I've always theorized that if you reverse the roles of any fan base and their team history, then the rhetoric that the fan base uses will flip as well. I mean, if you think about like Indiana, Purdue, and I always tell IU and Purdue fans this, if you took every event from the two schools' histories and flipped them around, you took every single coach and player and every win and loss and switched them between Indiana and Purdue, like Piggy Lambert and Gene Cady now coached at IU, Branch McCracken and Bob Knight now coach at Purdue. How would the fan bases change and react to that? Well, IU fans would do what Purdue fans do now. They would brag about their head-to-head record advantage or a lead in conference titles. And Purdue fans, what would they do? Well, they do what IU fans do now. They would talk about 5 banners and always being listed as a top-end historical program.
Well, and you see that with I'll just go, my favorite teams are the Bears, and you see that with Packers and Bears fans. Like right now, the Bears are in a historically lousy run with the Packers. And again, it's a rent-free in your head. Aaron, we just sold the team. Aaron Rodgers owns, and now he's passed it on to, and you listen. But then you go back to the '80s when I remember first becoming aware, and the Packers were terrible, And it was like, yeah, we just beat them again 38-10 on Monday night. It's their Super Bowl. We just humiliated them again. You know, Vince Lombardi is not coming through that door. We've got Bart Starr fired from the job. I mean, all sorts of good stuff where we're just kind of going, Ditka, our Hall of Famer is better than your Hall of Famer. And you're like 10, 11, 12 years old going, yeah, we got these guys for perpetuity. Brett Favre shows up, whole new ballgame. But
yeah, exactly.
It's a change.
Yeah.
And you're right. There's that sort of polar where it even happens inside these rivalries where you're not as dominant as you used to be, or you regain your dominance, and then the fan bases do that again.
Well, the best thing, if you think about it, is that you see it within individuals. Like I always think the best example is like Boston fans. Yeah. Like during baseball season, you think like Boston has like all four of their rivalries are some of the most prominent in sports. You know, it's like the Canadiens, Bruins, Celtics, Lakers, Red Sox, Yankees, and Patriots versus, well, everyone who's not a Patriots fan. Yeah. During baseball, Red Sox fans, they put on their Luke Skywalker helmet and say, you know, we're the little guy. We're attacking the Death Star. The Death Star is the Yankees. They're the bad guys. They're arrogant. They cheat. Their championships don't mean that much. And then
they bought them. They bought their
all
titles.
Those players. Exactly.
Starting with Babe Ruth. They bought him and they bought everybody else.
Stolen from us. Exactly. Now,
he was our guy.
So those same people, just weeks later, after the season is over in baseball, they will take off their Luke Skywalker helmet and happily and knowingly put on the Darth Vader helmet for the Patriots season. Look at the rings. They hate us because they ain't us. They're just jealous of, you know, we don't cheat. They're just jealous of, our success. The exact same fans will switch their arguments in support of their team based upon what is circumstantially advantageous for those fans and for that team.
And it could be noted the Vader helmet also has on a Celtics logo with a little leprechaun and a B for the Bruins.
Yeah.
That actually, even before the Patriots were lousy, they still had that, where it's like the Red Sox fan swaps over to that psychology. It's amazing. It's amazing. And so as we kind of go through this, let's talk about what does it really mean? You know, because all of this is kind of setting up what the real kind of thing is, which is at some point this does impact how fans see their program, but also what they demand from their programs, as well as how programs actually at times will adjust what they're doing because the rivalry has gotten out of control. So we'll do that after the break here on X's and Joe's.
Welcome back to X's and Joe's. I'm Mike Weemuth, joined by Coach Bob Motes. Bob, now we talked about the psych angle of rivalries. Maybe let's spend some time on some of the more, I guess, practical matters. Like, what do you do when your rival's success starts driving your team and your fan base absolutely crazy?
It's a great question, because I think the first thing, it's kind of like a stages of grief thing almost, where the awareness, I think the awareness that something is amiss, that you're not as competitive. And I mean, you can take this back to, I remember, even back in the, going back in the, when it was one thing when IU would lose at a Maui Invitational. It was something else where they get run off the floor. In fact, we started this show talking about IU getting run off the floor in Louisville, Kentucky. And all of a sudden you start thinking, well, maybe we need to do things differently. And then even before message board culture, which I think, and the internet, which I think has pushed that a little bit, you started hearing, well, is our guy up to the job? Mm-hmm. Mainly the head coach. Do we have the right type of players? Are we running the right type of offensive and defensive schemes? We don't necessarily want to be them, but we got to find something that beats them. And so at this point, it becomes more and more of a driving force. Whereas, like Lee Corso once famously said, "Look, I have two jobs. I got to beat Purdue and I got to beat Kentucky. If I do that, I save my job."
Yeah.
And when that goes away, and you started noticing this over the years with IU coaches, and this is true in rivalries as well, or in the case of, let's say, John Cooper at Ohio State.
Yeah.
And we talk about chip stacks a lot, and we're going to continue to talk about them. Like, this is almost like a super double jeopardy for you. Like the ante when you play a rival goes up 2, 3, 4 times of your usual chips being shoved in.
Yeah.
And that minimum bet goes up too. And the more you don't replenish from those rivalry wins, the more vulnerable that coach becomes.
Absolutely. We found that in the research that, that we've done on chip stacks, is that, they've done studies in different sports and it showed that one of the most significant predictable variables in determining whether a coach would be retained or fired was their performance against rivals and relative to rivals. Again, it kind of gets back to, what we talked about in segment 1 about that relativity thing. Again, it's the social comparison of fans sensing that, oh man, we're falling behind. And when the team falls behind, I fall behind against my neighbors, friends that are kind of like teasing me on message boards and, text messaging. So yeah, that all fits. It all kind of like ties together in a strange sort of way.
And I think from a fan, when you look at the fan perspective, and, fans matter in that they're buying the shirts, they're donating, they're buying tickets, they're tuning into the games. The engagement factor, I think, goes up significantly when they're feeling better about their programs.
Totally.
And the toxicity of everything goes up when they're not. And so when you start noticing, like, after a bad loss to Purdue, I remember sitting in Knicks, and we'll talk about Purdue specifically later, but I remember sitting in Knicks after the 97 Purdue loss where, Austin hit it in overtime. And there's John Walda, president of the board of trustees, and he just walks up. He's walking back to have dinner. I'm sitting there with, I think, Doug and some other guys, and he just goes, "Boy, that was a rough one." And I go, "Yeah, it was a rough one." And I mean, and that was, again, someone who, again, carries himself with a lot of dignity and class. But you also saw at the same time, at the end of that game, you had Purdue, Brad Miller and Brian Carton. Our fan base is just ripping into them.
Yeah.
Because, as you said, it's that you're no longer going to be socially acceptable.
Yeah, exactly.
And if you're in a mob, which is like a student section, and nobody knows who the heck you are, and everyone's doing the same thing, jump right on in.
Oh yeah, mob mentality. Reduces
mentality.
People's inhibitions.
Yeah, and I mean, now you're pushing over our ushers. We got a problem.
Yeah.
We got to fight the battle somehow as to why we're still not even relevant, but why we're still in the right in something. And I think that actually drives us as fans to a certain degree, that it starts pushing people to start making changes. It's harder to defend your program. It's harder to, because you can say, yeah, but that's staring you in the face. And the water cooler battle in a place like in Indiana, or with the Ohio State-Michigan rivalry, Duke Carolina, like if you saw 5 straight years where Duke didn't win to Carolina, the question is, how many head coaches would Duke go through?
Sure. Yeah.
And that's where the fan conversation becomes all the more problematic.
Yeah.
And it gets the attention of athletic directors, gets the attention of university presidents.
Yeah. And that's what we're talking about, in the chip stack conversation. And if you think about, especially in the context of social media, years ago, before you had message boards, before you had things like Peegs and Inside the Hall, there would be animosity. There would be public disquiet, let's say. But it was a little bit more subdued, and it had a little bit more, it took more to get the mob going in an environment where you had no social media. And now today, people who are thousands of miles away can basically participate in a virtual mob against a coach that they feel is underperforming. And so that just ratchets up all of the chips in the stack in terms of, what's at stake. And again, rivalries just do drive more chips being pushed in the middle. For on both ends, you think about how many times coaches have basically saved themselves by having poor performance generally, but having reasonably decent performance against their rivals that allow them to at least like skate along for a little bit longer. Mike Davis actually had a very good record against Purdue. And I've always theorized that had he had a poor record against Purdue, that perhaps he may have not been pushed out, multiple years ahead of time, but he certainly probably would have been much, much more danger than he did towards those last years of his tenure.
In his 5-year tenure, and I remember a specific, because there's a converse to the Mike Davis era, because Purdue was definitely down.
Yeah.
And we'll get, I think, this is actually an integral part of the conversation and a good switch for us, because Mike Davis, it was something where the Big Ten did something screwy with adding conference games, or I can't remember. They didn't. Did they expand the conference at that point? I can't remember if they expanded
one. They played one. I remember during the Mike Davis era, they played one at the Hoosier Dome. Yeah, exactly.
And it was like a 74-70 game. Bracy Wright, I think it was his freshman year. It was Marshall Strickland's freshman year. It was right off the Final Four run.
Yeah.
And what was bad about it, from the IU fans' perspective, was they should have won by more.
Mm-hmm.
How is it that Purdue's down and we're not kicking them? And it seemed like nobody got it.
Yeah.
And I mean that because I remember having that thought, like going, and I'm in my early mid-20s at this point, and I've been through a lot of, traumatic Purdue losses, play that card. But it was like, you can also, even in times where you're being relatively successful, you can still turn on your players. They just don't understand. And this was, again, on the heels of Bob Knight. Bob Knight had been fired 3 years prior. These guys just don't get it. He's going up against Gene Cady. You got to bring your A game, because eventually, when the talent evens out a little bit, and we don't get if we don't understand this game, and now it's kind of this sort of site, this thing, and these players that we were getting at that point throughout most of Mike Davis's run were not Indiana kids.
Yeah,
and so that begins to fuel that sort of conversation that we were having also. These local kids would understand the rivalry, and so
exactly.
You can sit in a cigar bar in Lincoln, Nebraska, and hear a guy talk about, those walk-ons from Nebraska will get it, and these 5-stars don't understand it. We've had this conversation before.
Yeah, the black shirts understand. And
yeah, they'll get it because they're from here, and they'll understand that you got to bring your A game against Oklahoma, or against you got to bring your A game, and that's that mindset. Even though now Nebraska or Iowa now, and the other Big Ten, Wisconsin, that you're wearing that pride of Nebraska here, and so
the name on the front of the jersey, not the back, and all that.
Because oftentimes our rivalry conversations are backwards looking as fans.
Yeah.
It's not about the future; it's about protecting your past. It's about protecting the nest egg. It's about preventing yourself from getting into a spot where you're living with the raccoons in the attic.
Yeah,
that's your fear, and.
Yeah.
Oh, well, these kids don't get it. And then all of a sudden, then it just kind of, you're taking something away from me. Mm. And I think with that, it's, when you're talking about programs and their engagement, when it gets bad to a certain level, and, again, we, bring up, like right now, Ryan Day is going through this at Ohio State to a certain degree. The guy's winning at an incredible number, an incredible level, but the Michigan thing is there.
Yeah.
And the program is noticing it.
Yeah.
And they're noticing it in a big way that you just and
there's also that bias of the contrast bias of the priors, right? You think about the record that Ohio State's had over Michigan in the last decade, almost 2 decades, where Michigan won like twice in like an 19-year period, and all of a sudden now Michigan has a streak going. So that actually makes it worse. I mean, if it were like kind of a back and forth, Woody versus Bo years where they're actually just swapping wins and losses, probably having a little bit of a streak go bad against you would be not great, but at least manageable. But if you've gone from where Michigan is completely down relative to Ohio State, and now Michigan has vaulted above Ohio State, now you really get into just almost like a whiplash effect in terms of like status and prestige between, the schools and also the fans.
Well, and I think, and that prestige, and now at that point, because when you go through maybe a 2-3 year losing streak, and especially, or you go through a 4-game, Archie Miller never beats Purdue, and that's on the list of sins. It's in the top 3.
Yeah.
It's in the top 3.
Exactly.
That you never beat Purdue. Bob Knight comes back for the first time. Lose to Purdue, and I mean, you had to win that game. This is the one, and that was a year where Purdue was sitting in top 25 in KenPom and with a 500 record, and you still get beat by double digits, and at that point, you start hearing boos in Assembly Hall. It becomes socially acceptable to, even though you were a tournament team, your low light of the season was that, and at that point, then it becomes easier for the program to look at this and say, well, what changes are you making? How are you doing this differently? Where, because at this point, this is almost like it's very superficial to a certain degree, because what's the difference ultimately between Purdue and Michigan when you look at conference standings? But our fan base looks at this from a much different perspective. And that's where the program, I think, starts. And this was, again, I think one of the big issues with Gene Cady was when they were losing to Mike Davis. And Bruce Weber, we talked about this, where Weber goes to Illinois with the big shifts. And you're losing maybe the guy that you think is going to bring, you lost your coach in waiting, so now we got to bring Matt Painter in.
Yeah.
I think in some respects it's pushed, I think it kind of pushed Duke to bring Mike Krzyzewski in to try a hot young coach to go up against Dean Smith.
Sure.
Somebody who was a Knight disciple, someone who could figure out how to bring this program in and then really build that rivalry. And then when Krzyzewski finally caught up to Dean and in many respects surpassed him, Dean goes away from some of the recruiting that he was doing with, again, heavy on bigs.
Yeah.
You didn't really see you saw the Montroses in there, but he wasn't the focal point of the offense like a Brad Daugherty was when he was there.
Yeah.
You get, you start noticing that, now you start seeing the stack houses. Yeah. Now you start seeing, just
NBA, consistent flow of NBA level guards and wings,
right,
at a higher rate than before.
At a higher rate, and guys that were going to be highlighted on NBA teams, not just really good pieces.
Yeah.
Fewer Jeff Lebos, more Jerry Stackhouses.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. Vince Carter too, right? I mean, he was on that. Yeah. He fits that. So it really kind of pushes this whole narrative that, okay, I have to stay on top of this guy, because if I don't, and because especially in geographical rivalries, you're oftentimes going after the same dudes.
Yeah.
It's a
zero-sum game.
That's a zero-sum game.
The definition of a zero-sum game. You get them and they don't.
And I mean, we've seen this how many times at IU where you got a really angry Purdue kid because IU said, we want you to go to Purdue.
Mm-hmm. Essentially, yeah.
Essentially, I mean, and so
like the head coach.
Yeah, exactly. And how does that push, as a program, then as an athletic director, as a university president, you're now looking at this from a standpoint of now we have real money on the table, real skin in the game.
Yeah.
And we're not going to, so yeah, there's usually more sins, but because, and they see those chip stacks have evaporated to a certain level, at that point, the buyout becomes worth it, because your first job, Lee says, you got to beat Purdue. You've got to beat Kentucky.
Yeah.
And really oftentimes it just comes down to, because we're the more modern place. We're the place that isn't plodding along with the bigs.
Yeah.
You look at a prime example, because I think oftentimes, we look at these schools, oftentimes they are polar opposites from each other.
Yeah. Sometimes by necessity.
By necessity. Yeah. I think that's the Purdue IU relationship in many respects.
In some ways.
But like when you look down at Kentucky and Louisville, which is a great rivalry, and has been for off and on over the last 50, 60 years. Denny Crum versus Eddie Sutton versus Joby Hall, those programs were just different. One was a metro inside driven team, the Doctors of Dunk, whereas Kentucky's always been about, really at that point it was about shooting.
Yeah.
So, now you see two contrasting styles. And if you're a Louisville kid, and a Louisville fan, you know that, well, our style is better than the Kentucky style. And a lot of times that is a necessity conversation that coaches have to have because of the types of guys they're bringing in.
Yeah, exactly. Nope, that's very true. You think if you are recruiting it for like a very specific type and you lose out consistently on that particular type, whether it's like, an option quarterback, then you may have to start going for the pass-oriented offense. Or otherwise, you're going to have to just settle for the backups, for the type of player that your rival is basically now just like, scooping right out under, from beneath your feet. So yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, I think it's interesting. You can have like sometimes rivalries where teams are a little bit further apart and they don't compete for the same recruits exactly. And their pools are a little bit more segregated from each other. Those where you can actually kind of see like, passing team versus passing team, a little bit more consistently.
Well, and I'd also throw, kind of look at this, I think similar type of mindset, like when we saw, the Notre Dame Miami rivalry of the 90s or the 80s.
Yeah.
That's and you talk about
yeah,
totally different. The optics were different. The styles were different. You look at Jimmy Johnson versus Lou Holtz, and you look at the quarterbacks, Tony Rice versus,
Steve Erickson,
right? Or Walsh,
yeah.
Or even going back to Testaverde with
Toretta, all those guys.
those guys, and just the raw athleticism of Miami, as it was called, and then the tradition of the Golden Dome and the Leprechaun, and it was all this sort of all of that. You had two polar opposites, and they're getting into fist fights in the tunnel. You talk about great television.
Oh yeah, exactly.
I think that rivalry drives, and this is what makes this again really essential to understanding why these matter. NBC gets Notre Dame, I think, in no small part because Notre Dame brings in we had at that point 4 or 5 rivalries that were events.
Yeah,
and like. That was the marquee. They're an independent program that everyone just got up to play, and they got fired up to play.
Exactly, and they were segmented throughout the season. Like the Michigan game was usually in September.
The
USC game was if it was at Notre Dame was in October, or if it's at USC it was like November. And so you'd have them all kind of spread out. So it's like perfect almost when you think about it from a broadcasting standpoint. It's like, oh, well, this is ideal. We've got like 4 or 5 ready-made, high viewership games just set, in the schedule every single year.
And it's why you see again where ESPN places the Duke UNC game at 9:00.
Yeah.
There's never going to be the 7:00 game. That's the 9:00 on a usually Thursday or weekend.
Yeah.
And because they know the country's going to tune in because the visuals alone between these two programs are enough to drive people. And so there's they're opposite of style, opposite in substance, opposite in optics. It's opposite in culture that, these rivalries sometimes, and even if it's not there, it can be manufactured to feel like it's there. Because really, culturally, is there a major difference between Duke and Carolina?
Yeah, I mean, if you go down there, they will say that
they will say it, and they would say the same thing about us. Like, why are you really different than Purdue? Yeah, we are and we aren't. I think we have better restaurants.
Yeah,
and
different students, different areas of focus.
Although we've got but I mean we both have a business school. We both train teachers.
Yeah.
They have more engineers. We have more. Doctors. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Boy, that took me a minute. No, yeah. Cause I was going to pass organic chem. So I'm going to go. So when we come back from our next break here, we're going to talk a little bit about, we're kind of jumping into that Purdue conversation. We're going to talk about our feelings about Purdue a little bit, our feelings about Kentucky, as well as why we think it's healthy for us. So when we come back after the break on the Back Home Network.
Thanks.
All right, Mike, brass tacks. Do you really hate Purdue?
Good question, Bob.
Do you loathe Purdue?
Maybe when I see, as soon as I see Edie getting the ball in the post and we've got a bad angle on him, maybe in that like 0.3 seconds between the time he catches the ball and he's like dunking on Malik Renew's head, then maybe a little bit. But yeah, no, I don't have maybe as much enmity towards Purdue as the average fan. So should I explain? Should I explain why?
Yeah, go for it, because I'm going to throw in my thing here in a second, but go ahead on that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this is an open forum on this segment. So
yeah.
So yeah, I would say back in my childhood, I was not that much different than just the average fan in terms of the sense of rivalries. I was probably maybe not like a intense Purdue hater compared to like a lot of my other IU brethren. But, I would say that definitely I wanted to beat Purdue pretty badly and didn't have necessarily the best view of them overall. I would say that changed a little bit. And I have a story behind maybe the origin story of how that shifted. So if you go back in like the early 2000s in my career, I just moved to Philadelphia and I was a training and recruiting coordinator manager at a products company here in Philadelphia. And every few weeks, we'd bring in new hires from different parts of the country to do like a week-long orientation. So this one week, I had all new hires from the southeast region of the United States. And it was a week-long training. Typically, the last night before everyone flew back home, I'd take them out to Maggiano's restaurant in downtown Philly for a big, family-style meal.
We've been there. I
Yes.
think. No.
Yeah. I think we grabbed some food there once.
Yeah,
exactly. So in this particular dinner this one night with all of these new hires from the Southeast, there were fans from 5 separate SEC schools. I believe it was Auburn, Alabama, Kentucky, Ole Miss, and LSU. And because it was the last night and they had drank a decent volume of liquid encouragement during the dinner, they all began to engage in a verbal argument over each school's history of cheating against their own team. And not only that, all the while...
Badge of honor.
Exactly. All the while fully acknowledging their own teams were cheating at the same time, but fully convinced that the other school's cheating was somehow categorically different and just morally indefensible. And I don't know. I mean, as you can probably tell, like as a Midwestern boy, I just found this absolutely hilarious. It was like I never seen that before. It was thematically, it was almost like watching the 5 New York crime families argue over which ones had murdered more labor officials than the others. It's like
we know where our bodies are, but exactly. Yours.
Yeah, we in the Gambino family were murdered 3 reps this year, but the Lucchese family has killed 7, and that's just indefensible. And so, all that conversation, except it's like about football and done within an accent range between Stonewall Jackson and Foghorn Leghorn. So it was, so during this Dixieland Gomorrah, I remember thinking after leaving that dinner, like morally, how can you have that much antagonism against a school like Purdue, who objectively tries to do things the right way, when you know that there are far worse actors in the sport, like the ones you just saw at that dinner table? Mm-hmm. And since that, so I remember, like, since that evening, I have a bit of a, let's say, a complex view of Purdue. It's not, I think that it's obvious that there are good qualities about Purdue. Matt Painter's a great guy. Gene Katie's a good guy. They do try to do things right. I have different critiques of them, but I would say that absolutely that experience did change my perspective on how I look at it. So that's my story. Now, what's your view?
When you grow up in Columbus, Indiana, in a town full of engineers, you have a few Purdue people, a lot of UL people, I might add too. We get them from all over, but this is always a fairly healthy, and there's always been kind of a fairly healthy sort of. We're Midwesterners. We're nice to each other, so especially Hoosiers, we're nice to each other, and that's whether you're Purdue, IU, wherever. You have that sort of relationship because you got to live with these people after it's all over. You don't have the anonymity that you have in other places. Yeah. That being said, that rivalry between IU and Purdue in the 90s or the 80s, it was always, the world shuts down, 90s world shuts down. It's like we beat them, we got them. And there was a lot of swapping home and home. Like we go to West Lafayette, we get beat. They go to Bloomington, they get beat. And so everyone kind of saved enough face and you just kind of expected to go 1-1, and that was the end of it. No Big Ten tournament that day either. So there was no rubber match at the end, unless it was 1980. And that's why Mike Woodson, I think, still really wanted to beat Purdue a lot. Yeah. Just they ended his college career. So I remember, though, going to an IU game, IU Purdue game. It was my first. It was my it was my junior year, and we're there with our friend that we talked about earlier, and a couple other dudes we had tickets with, and Purdue beats IU at Assembly Hall in 1996.
Okay, such like Austin?
That was Austin's first.
Okay.
And I remember seeing this little 5'11" guy, I think he's 5'11", Todd Foster, stomping on the IUI, just giving it and the ball, somebody either kicked the ball or fired the ball, hits the scoreboard. Yeah. I mean, they're just obnoxious. And I'm going, what? Where does this come from? I mean, we don't really like you, but this is a hatred. And so it's like almost visceral. Yeah. And you almost kind of like, when did all this kind of happen? And, from their perspective, and I think it was you who told me, well, Todd Foster wanted to go to Indiana. Oh, but fast forward, many years later, I meet my wife. She grew up in, the Rensselaer area, actually in Rensselaer. Yeah. Parents are, met at grad school in Purdue. Mm. And she talks about when she was at Rensselaer High School in the mid 90s, or maybe it was middle school, because she's a couple years younger than me. I think it was high school. The Sunshine Club had this that brought in this Purdue basketball player. He's just the nicest guy on the face of the earth. It was Todd Foster. Yeah. We were a few months into the relationship. We're a few months into the relationship, and you just have that thought of, nice guy. Let me tell you about this so and so. Let me tell you what this SOB did.
Let's go on Galen Clavio's account and show you what he did at the end of the game.
Yeah, I will show you. And it's like, and how? I mean, I wanted to physically maim the guy. Okay, you wanted. Oh, he was so dreamy. Brian Cardinal was so. You loved Brian Cardinal and Brad Miller. You went to a couple Purdue games and saw him play, and at that point, like that. But at the same time, I mean. I always jokingly say that I always keep at least one assistant with a Purdue backing. Yeah. Or another pro, basically I don't want a bunch of IU guys, meaning I want someone who's going to see this a little differently. Yeah. But more than because I know that we're going to see some things differently. And, whether it was Jay Payne or Mo Humphrey, who are both big Purdue fans, Jay went there. Or, going over the years of guys that I've coached with that, Bill Porter, who coached with me for a few years, he was a Purdue guy out of Lebanon of all places. So he knows a thing or two about that area and the game. Yeah. But, these were really good. It's always good to kind of have some balance. And so I think over the years, my hatred's been more or less just almost a benign annoyance.
Yeah, that's probably a good way to put it, I guess. Yeah. And
my benign annoyance with Purdue really stems more from just the fact that, most of their fans are just phenomenal. They're great.
I
remember how I was at a 2002 bucket game. The 99 bucket game. We had food and drinks, and the Purdue fraternity ran out of beverages, so we, entertained them, finish up.
That, yeah.
finished off the keg, that sort of thing. And we just had a great time, just sitting out there in the middle, in our 20s, just enjoying each other's company. Yeah. I threw beers down 2 years before that when they were, some people parked in my parking lot. It's like, yeah, here, have a beer. You know what? Because even then, it's like you're not really all that, it's the hatred really isn't towards their fan base. It's really towards the rivalry itself. It's more of a self-perpetuating.
It's more the situation, the
situation than it is anything else. But you wanted to feel welcome when they were in Bloomington.
Oh yeah,
I go to Ross-Ade Stadium wearing something like this, and I get hit with a Coke. I'm not kidding. 20 years ago, I was there for I was there for a Purdue Michigan game because it's warm, and I wanted to show my support for the Indiana school because I don't really want Michigan to win. And about the third quarter, I feel plop, and it's like, hey. Yeah. We don't do this to you guys. If we do this to you, I want to know about it.
Yeah.
So it's that annoyance.
Yeah, it's interesting, I think, and I would say that's a good way to put it. Like, I kind of agree with you. Like, my experience is also the same. I would say that like 90% of the Purdue people I know are like objectively cool. They're objectively cool. Like I would say like Purdue people, I would actually put above like Michigan people and others. Like, even like, I would say like Purdue folks generally are probably like towards the top of who I would want to hang out with. If there's a big bar and all Big Ten people around, I would probably have a lot more fun hang out with the Purdue people just generally.
Well, and I can tell you institutionally, that's the case.
Yeah.
The Commonwealth, the Committee for Institutional Collaboration, which was the academic Big Ten, doesn't happen if IU and Purdue aren't working together.
Yeah.
Our student governments, we worked together all the time. We knew it's like, because we also knew there was a power to saying we were together on something, especially when the state budget came along.
Sure.
Or we were a voting block in the Association of Big Ten Students. I mean, nobody really cares about this, but it's just to kind of show that. My favorite example, though, is COVID, where IU basically turned all the public relations over to Mitch Daniels because they figured that they could, and the institutions worked so closely together on response, both on campus as well as some of their research and service initiatives.
Yeah.
It's well coordinated. Yeah. So at the end of the day.
Rivalry in sports, but collaboration elsewhere.
It's like the Army and the Navy. If the barbarians are at the gates, you bet that the Navy is going to be shelling to support Army positions. That's how this works.
Yeah.
And that's where this gets to, and I think it's true, across the board, but I really think in this case it kind of jumps out at me as like it runs a lot deeper than just your football team's better than my football team.
Yeah. Yeah. That's true. And like I said, I really love a lot of the things that Purdue does, like institutionally. I'm from a family that, likes aviation. And so everything that has to do with, Neil Armstrong and basically
Gus
what Purdue
Grissom.
Gus Grissom and Amelia Earhart was a professor there. So that stuff is great. I'd say that, to be fair, like, the part of the Purdue that I guess I would say is the annoyance part, to expose the other side of the coin here. I guess, at the fan side, like my biggest rivalry with any Purdue people are like a tiny, tiny sliver of the Purdue fan base. It's like those annoying prestige deprived trolls who always seem to contact me when Purdue has won something.
Yeah.
And I remember it was years ago, like Purdue had beaten IU in some game, and it kind of clobbered them. Out of nowhere, there's this guy that I had not spoken to in like 15, 20 years, just like instant messages me out of nowhere. It's like, hey, we kicked your ass. And I didn't even remember that he went to Purdue. It's like, oh yeah, there's that guy from school. Oh, I guess he's a Purdue guy because, he's wasted and I can see Harry's, in the background. So,
that's a hive.
Yeah. So it was just odd just thinking like, wow, you must have been carrying around a lot of baggage to pull this out like 15, 20 years later, just to shoot out a message, out of right field like that. Like I've never thought to myself after a big IU win over Purdue, it's like, hey, why don't I rifle through the old junior high yearbook and see who I can randomly bugger and smack talk at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday night?
Because I know when we were playing football in the 8th grade, this guy came to practice in a Purdue jersey.
Yeah,
as his practice jersey. I know
exactly.
that guy.
Yeah, go ahead.
But again, we kind of go back. I mean, Purdue's kind of that traditional one, but I mean, for us, and our other big traditional rivalry, one that we've been to that game with ourselves on several occasions when we used to have it especially at the old Hoosier Dome, and it will always be the Hoosier Dome.
Yeah.
Kentucky, when you really think about that second rivalry, and over the years, I think we were both sitting together during the infamous black football jersey game of 1997.
Oh yeah.
Where Tim Couch came in and just obliterated, the Hoosiers. And I think it's actually safer for many of us to be more visceral towards the University of Kentucky than Purdue.
Yeah.
I don't know why. I think part of it is, they're not in the state.
Yeah.
Border state. Other thing is, well, there's also the whole Southeastern Conference thing.
Like we're talking about the dinner.
pre NIL days.
Yeah.
Well, we knew they had bags. We know that they're buying their players. Jamal Mashburn just doesn't come down to the Duck State of Kentucky just because he likes them, because he wants to see a horse up close.
Oh, absolutely.
All that.
Yeah, I mean, at that dinner I was describing earlier, there was a UK person at the table, and it took like every bit of my HR sense of professionalism not to veer into some Chris Mills, Emory Worldwide diatribe. Like, you know where that money came from.
Know where it was.
Yeah.
And I mean, there are times where it's like, they can't, where we've gone down and approached some of their guys, but they've been more like grabbing a kid like a Kyle Macy out of the state or the Sean Kemp situation.
Yeah.
And there was always this sort of feeling of crookedness and corruption that always just kind of and there was always like one kid that you grew up with that was a Kentucky fan. And I've got a friend of mine, Bennett, JB, he talks all the time, like he's still a big UK fan. And, my first meeting, I actually argued and I was wrong on the sports argument in a bar. Mm. I actually went across and got my IU Night book, and I had to go show that I was wrong to him because I thought I was right. Because I believe we won the 92-93 matchup. I was wrong. We did not against the University of Kentucky.
Yeah. The one in the one in Freedom Hall.
Freedom Hall. Yeah, because the next year at the Dome was the one I was thinking of.
Yeah, yeah.
And I mean, first meeting with this guy, and I mean, he's been reminding me of this for 25 years. So it's it's like, but I think that there is, when we talk about stylistic differences between the programs, there is a difference.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I always say like the distinction between Purdue and IU, or Purdue and Kentucky and the rivalry and how I view them. Like, one is kind of like you said, like a moral one with Kentucky. Now, of course, I've Kentucky friends too, and they have their own defense attorney retort to some of the bullet points I put out there. So I'm just giving my perspective. Obviously, there's a counter to that. Purdue is definitely more like I said, like a stylistic one. It's it's not. Yeah, it's weird. Like, thinking back, my beef with Purdue is, they often don't help the Big Ten's problem with the brutish Greco-Roman style of basketball that, plagues the league, especially in March.
Right.
Going back, my first recollection of seeing a basketball player with wrist tape and elbow pads was watching Purdue like in the early 80s on TTV4. You think of Rowinski, Scheffler, Riley, Cardinal. I mean, they always seem to have that guy somewhere on the team that was just like, wrecking ball, throwing elbows, in the lane. And
you actually asked for a really interesting thing recently. I don't know what you're going to do with it, of the Scheffler flop at the end of an IU Purdue game in '89.
Yeah, that's I haven't decided what that was, but
that's gift worthy.
Yeah, that was not. Yeah, Tony was nice. Tony Adrani was nice enough to basically clip it, and Jared Morris was. Jared actually posted, I think, on X. That's
awesome.
Yeah, I remember watching that live. I'm like, oh my god, did he have a neurological episode that caused a 280
flopping for a foul?
Yeah, it was. Yeah,
who does that?
Especially Scheffler. I mean, he was the ultimate kind of cryboy idea of like, he's going to just play play wrestler for 39 minutes and then, at the end, take a dive. So yeah, it was funny. Like the first time I remember seeing like that gear on a Purdue player, I had that same reaction, like that scene of the Blues Brothers when they see the stage at Bob's Country Bunker, the chicken wire. I remember seeing like elbow pads, like fellas, are you sure in the right place? Like the wrestling gym is, I think, 2 doors down the hall. And the funny thing is, it's not always like that. It's like, that's the stereotype. There are many times where Purdue's had teams that I really like. I mean, I love the Baby Boilers in terms of stylistically. Like Jawan Johnson is like the perfect kind of big I would like to see more of in the Big Ten. Athletic, 6'10", can hit shots from anywhere, very modern in that sense. And then they replaced him with A.J. Hammonds. And it was like a 180 turn of the wheel back towards like the plow horse basketball style. I was like, no, wrong way, turn that way.
But there is that, and it's interesting, and I kind of, before we kind of wrap up this one here soon, as I look at this sort of, Purdue, the culture there is workhorse. Mm-hmm. And so I never really see them as actually going into this sort of UK sort of, UK 90s sort of approach, or even UK this year. It's going to be, I think, a lot of this. It's going to kind of, harken back to Piggy Lambert running 1930s offenses, and John. We're the institution with John Wooden. He graduated from here, and so it's in so many ways it is. So I kind of see it almost as a revert to form. Kind of like I'll never see Wisconsin. I don't think we're ever going to see Wisconsin run, run an empty ball side, and havoc defense. Yeah, it just feels weird to think of that being a possibility. And I think from us as fans of the game, you're like, how the hell are they still winning?
Yeah.
How is it? The bottom's got to drop out of this thing.
Yeah. We could do a pod on Wisconsin someday. We could actually do that for 2 hours.
We will do Wisconsin someday, because I know but Wisconsin is pretty much a battle cry that you've heard for 20 plus years. And, but it's also Purdue and tackle basketball. Yeah. And I mean, at the same, and really, it's like at this point, even Kentucky this year is a little different, but in the last few years, Kentucky hasn't been the same Kentucky.
Sure,
they haven't been the same type of program, and you hear that in their fan base, because and at this point, what's helping? I think one thing that's helping Calipari, Indiana's not exactly cutting down nets these days. Yeah, Louisville is a dumpster. Wreck. A dumpster. It's a train wreck
going into a dumpster
fire with the Hindenburg crashing into it. Yeah. I mean, and there's got to be an atomic explosion someplace.
Exactly.
I mean,
going into Chernobyl reactor 4.
Reactor 4. Yeah. Right. And I mean, so but at the same time, the rest of the Southeastern Conference is kind of caught up to a certain level, and so it's one of the again, I think probably top 2 basketball conferences. Actually maybe 3 when you throw the Big East into play. You can debate those 3. I don't put the Big Ten in the top 3 at this point, just because I don't think it's there. But Kentucky, I think but they're all at this point. I think that it's just a different. The IU rivalries are at such a place right now where it's going to be interesting in the next 5 years to see how all this shakes out.
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, it's going to be interesting.
And ultimately, is it healthy for us to have these?
100%. Imagine sports without them.
No, I can't. Yeah. I'll say this much from a coaching standpoint. Even little elementary schools here, they're not all that little, but with kids, you go through a grind of a 12-game season where you're playing everybody. Yeah. And there's some games that okay, this is Southside for Parkside. This is our rivalry game, and it's really important. That we are on our A game for this one. Yeah. We always have to be on our A game. But the emotional stakes rise here. And we kind of it's a thing where, again, and we both grew up in 2 high school towns, Northeast or North South in Terre Haute. There is you never know what's going to happen in those games, particularly because the emotional factor. These are kids you grew up with. These are kids you play on travel ball teams with now. These are kids that you may date their sister. It's
exactly.
That
they could be family down the road.
They could be family down the road, and you want Thanksgiving. You need Thanksgiving. You want to have those bragging rights. You may never use them, but you want to make sure you have them in your hip pocket.
Sure. Yeah.
And it is healthy for us because I think it does kind of allow us a level of socially acceptable tribalism.
Exactly. I always call it low consequence tribalism is much better than the high consequence we see in other parts of our society.
Well, again, it's not like we're fighting a war over any of this.
Exactly.
So, that's the plus of it.
Yeah.
So, guys, we're at the end of this road. We want to say a big thank you to Bob Thompson for the music and soundtrack you hear on this show, and special thanks to John Ringer of ringdesign.com for designing the logo and the artwork you see. And I'm gonna before I kick it over here, we're gonna do things a little differently in episode 6. We're actually gonna put a third person on this for this one episode.
I know, an actual guest.
An actual guest. It's more like it's instead of a guest, because I don't think you and I here, we're not like Tom Snyder, doing Tom Snyder and Dick Cavett meet here, because exactly. We are kind of the Tomorrow Show and the Dick Cavett Show of the home field network. If somebody calls the Tonight Show, we just kind of we jump in afterwards and kind of do our thing.
Yeah.
But in coming days, we're really excited to bring on somebody here, a good friend of ours who we've gotten to know over the years, who we think is debuting on the streaming internet. We're not really sure yet.
I don't believe he's actually formally ever been on such a broadcast.
I don't think so either. And he's uniquely situated, and many of you will know who he is. And if you don't know who he is when we announce, you're going to want to get to know this guy.
Exactly.
He's a top, and add on to a top-notch dude. So
yep, exactly. Yep. So we will probably be and we'll be putting that out on social media at some point, and we will share this individual's name at some point. But check the Twitters and on the the Back Home Network for that update. So
we'll get it out there.
Yep. This was a fun episode.
Yeah, it was. And real quick, that episode is going to be how programs evaluate who they bring in, a lively discussion about recruit and transfer scouting, player selection, and coaching hires.
Great. Thanks, Bob. So this endless conversation was brought to you by the Back Home Network. Please check out all the great BHN content, including Assembly Call, Doing the Work, and Crimson Cast on YouTube and backhomenetwork.com. So, until next time, I'm Mike Weemuth.
And I'm Bob Motes.
Have a good one, everyone. Take care.
Hope you bought flowers today if you haven't.
Exactly. There's still 90 minutes left.
You've got 90 minutes left. You can make this happen.
Exactly. Goodbye, everyone.